For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on!
Oh my gosh, you guys, Merry Christmas! I can't believe we're on the last chapter. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. For all of you guys who stuck with it from the beginning to the end, I hope you enjoyed the story. Thanks for loving the story as much as Aaron and I both love the story. And so, without further ado, let's dive in to chapter 25, Claus' Village. They floated through a tunnel walled in thick layers of ice. Icicles hung from the ceiling, and the walls reflected like mirrors. The current pulled them along. It wasn't dark, but bright as the walls of ice had luminescent crystals infused throughout. They kept their attention forward, and soon enough, the patch of ice knocked them into a dock. Nick leapt from the ice and onto the dock, Comet following along. Nick took a sweeping look around the cavern. There were old drawings of the first elves who settled in the North Pole, etched into the rock far below the ice, comparable to the sketches of human cavemen of prehistoric time. Nick's attention was drawn to a tunnel he entered, Comet trailing at his heels. The tunnel was long, cutting through the glacier in a curve. It eventually opened up into a glorious city. It was remarkable. Before was the magnificent Claus village in all its splendor. The Great Hall stood in the city's central, a town square laying before it, with shops circling around a magnificent frozen fountain of St. Nikolai. The village had to be about 3 miles in circumference, surrounded by tall glaciers of thick ice. Little homes and charming cottages were scattered throughout, with magnificent structures, architected with quirky, whimsical designs comparable to nowhere else in the world. There were ornate buildings and stadiums, and even an edifice comparable to the Colosseum in Rome. All of this was opened up to the sky, where a spectacular display of the Aurora Borealis lights could vibrantly be seen. Nick stood there, breathtaking. He felt like he had fallen right into a snow globe. His eyes then fell on the tallest, most spectacular building in all of the city, the Great Hall, and instantly the stone vibrated in his hand. "They're there," he said with certainty. "The orphans, my friends." His eyes lit and narrowed, and Alvamark too. With a quickened pace they reached the outskirts. They entered the city. It seemed unusually quiet, and the streets left empty. They passed vacant shops and eateries, and found that all the homes and cottages had their curtains drawn tightly shut. Nick knew that this wasn't Claus' village. Not really. It was only a shadow of what it once was, now that his uncle was in charge. Nick and Comet followed a snow-dusted street to the center of the city, past the statue of St. Nikolai and up the icy steps of the Great Hall. They stepped onto a balcony. It was an enormous open area made of pearly granite with a massively tall Christmas tree that was dried and dead. Nick strolled through the towering pillars and across the marble floor of the Great Hall. A great big chandelier hung from the ceiling, suspended above a lobby filled with lounging chairs. The chandelier was molded by artistic glass blowing, a telling sign that it was a Pepper Plum Sparkles and Shine original. Nick and Comet worked their way through the deserted lobby and into a spectacular room where an enormous model of the planet Earth rotating around and around, so big it was floor to ceiling. Nick rounded the globe with a curious gleam in his eyes, observing red and green lights flickering throughout the world. He stopped, noticing instruments mounted on a desk filled with buttons, levers, and strange beeping gadgets. He quickly came to a realization that the green lights located monsters around the world, the red ones children who were in danger. They continued on, slipping into a corridor, sneaking peeks into chambers as they went. They found a dining hall, a library, a drawing room, and other such chambers comparable to ones that might be found in a British castle. They then spotted a door marked as Undercroft. Nick opened the door, revealing a steep stairwell disappearing off into the dark. They descended. The village was quiet, and the Great Hall just as desolate. They hadn't passed a single elf since they'd arrived. It was as if everyone in town was in hiding, and Nick had a sneaking suspicion as to why. They arrived in the basement, but it looked more like a library. There were many books and scrolls neatly organized in their own specific category. Nick worked his way through the labyrinth of towering bookcases, stopping at a door frozen in ice. The door seemingly out of place. Nick pushed it open, revealing a cold, icy chamber. Dozens of cages lined the long, narrow room, some stacked as many as 4 high. It looked like a shelter for unwanted animals. But instead of poor, unlucky mutts, there were children. Loads and loads of frightened children, including all of the orphans from Lost Star Orphanage. "Nick!" Emma threw herself against the icy bars and shouted, "Nick, it's you! You're here!" Abigail, curled up in a ball, opened her sleepy eyes and spluttered, "Nick? Is it really him?" asked Iris. "If not, then he's got a twin," said Milo. Luke rubbed his eyes until he was awake, and then spotted Nick. "It is him!" "Who?" asked Dover in the cage above. "Nick," Holly shouted in the cage directly across from them. All the children went to the icy bars of their confines, laughing and cheering after spotting their big brother. The whole Pransley family was waving from a cage near the ceiling, and Bafana and Bartholomew were in the cage beside them. Emma, Mr. McTwizzle, and Cupid were all locked up together, along with Gilbert squeaking away on Emma's shoulder. The chamber was large, but appeared much smaller with the number of cages stacked to the ceiling, stretching from wall to wall. There were so many happy faces looking back at Nick, some he recognized, but more that he didn't. There were a lot of children in the cages, close to 100 by the looks of it, but the only ones Nick recognized that weren't orphans from Lost Star Orphanage were the grandchildren of the captain from the SS Vixen. Toby complained from the cage directly across from Emma's. "Well, it's about time. I hope you brought a snack. My stomach's been rumbling for weeks." "Nick, how did you get here?" Emma asked through the bars of her cage. When he got close enough, she noticed something about him she didn't recognize. "Something's different about you," she questioned further. "What happened to you?" "Magic." Nick lifted his fingers and snapped, her cage blowing open at his command. Emma ran out with the field mouse on her shoulder, with Cupid and Mr. McTwizzle following. While Nick handed Emma the satchel, the toy maker took off his spectacles, cleaned them with the seam of his vest, and then fixed them back on. He gave Nick a peculiar look. "You found it, didn't you?" "The stone?" asked Nick. "No," Mr. McTwizzle dismissed. "What I'm referring to is something far more precious." His eyes twinkled through his half-moon glasses. "I'm talking about your spark." Nick smiled. "I did." Nick pulled away from the toy maker, heading down the aisle amongst the rows of towering cages. He lifted a finger and twirled it. All of the cage doors popped open one after the next until all the children were free. Olivia, Faye, their parents, and other children too scaled down ladders from the high crates, while others ran out of theirs, all circling, Nick cheering. Nick shouted loud enough to be heard over the rowdy children. "All right, everyone, listen up. I'm going to get you all out of here. Now follow me." "Nick," Emma shouldered through the horde of children, fighting her way toward Nick amongst all of the celebration. "It's too easy," she carefully calculated their situation. "It's got to be a trap. I'm counting on it." He cupped his mouth and shouted, "Let's go!" Nick led the way back through the great hall, and the children, friends included, followed close behind. They marched up the stairs to the upper level, made way through the corridor, back into the lobby, then out onto the pearly granite balcony. As he marched along, Nick looked up and caught the green lights his mother was named after, sparkling ever so brightly. He then peered ahead to the tall dead Christmas tree that left them all cast in a dark shadow. He knew Emma was right. It was too easy. Nick wiggled his fingers and smiled mischievously. "I'm ready." They were halfway across the balcony when an icy voice stopped them cold. "Not so fast, nephew." Nick and his friends whirled around. There was Lord Albemarle between the great hall pillars, standing 7 feet tall on hooves. His emerald cape blew in the snowy wind. He was even more terrifying than Nick remembered. Scarred snout, hunched back, glowing eyes, and many rows of sharp overlapping fangs. He might have been born an elf, but children's fears terribly deformed him. He looked like a monster plucked right out from a child's nightmare. The northern staff was clutched in his claw. The branches at the top curled around an empty space where the stone had once been fastened. Belsnickel stood proudly beside him, along with 3 grunting Yeti. "You wouldn't leave without first saying hello to your dear uncle now, would you?" Lord Albemarle flashed his fangs, sending the younger children to scurry behind Mr. and Miss Pransley. "I always knew it would end like this." He stomped toward Nick, his cloak blowing wildly in the flurry of snow. Nick stepped forward, his shoulders high, all while 100 children circled around the brown, decaying Christmas tree. Nick felt more certain of himself than he'd ever felt before. He wasn't scared, nor was he intimidated at all. How does it feel, Uncle, to chase your nephew around the world? He smirked, but never catch him. Avamork's thick, scaly gullet rumbled with a deep, sinister chuckle. Stupid boy. If I wanted you dead, I would have killed you weeks ago. He began to circle Nick, his heavy stomps shuddering the granite floor beneath Nick's boots. You think I'm some fool, do you? Did you think that I didn't know you were quivering under your bed the night I broke into your orphanage? His emerald eyes leered down at his nephew, catching the salty scent of fear that Nick tried to mask behind a brave face. I know my sister. She thought she was clever. She was good with magic, I'll give her that. To protect you, he cringed. She cast an enchantment on your orphanage to shield you from me. But she also put one on the stone. Such magic is intricate and hard to do. It's taxing, and so it took all the magic she had. What are you talking about? Nick questioning his uncle's accusations. The stone, he roared, spraying spit. My sister put an enchantment on the stone, ensuring only she could give it to you. I knew you didn't have it. You were a baby, but my sister did. And because of that, I killed her. He continued to pace while he explained. I murdered her, enticing anger and trying to elicit fear in Nick, he continued. But still, the stone wouldn't appear to you until she gave it to you. The enchantment was locked. It had to be her, and only her, and so I waited until her spirit came to you at the gates of Twilight Bridge. Twilight Bridge? Spluttered Nick. If you would have drudged any deeper into that cave, you would have found an enchanted door, and locked behind it hundreds of monsters. Avamork smirked, flashing his rotten fangs. You might have found your spark, the heart of every elf's power, but you're still just an orphan. A pathetic, half-bred orphan. A pathetic, half-breed orphan. Avamork curled his claw tightly around the northern staff, then directed it toward Nick. The stone rumbled in his pocket, then shot out and fixed itself within the spiral of branches. The whole village started to quake. The streets rumbled, the structures swayed, and chunks of ice began to loosen and fall from the tops of the glacier walls. Avamork held up the northern staff, the rod aggressively vibrating as the stone glistened. For so many years I dreamt of this moment. He gritted his fangs, his eyes gleaming with the stone, and finally it has come at last. The ruby seeped with a power that coursed through the long rod into Avamork's claws, pulsing through his body in ecstasy. Claus' village continued to quake. The balcony rumbled, leaving all the children stumbling about. It should have been mine to begin with. Lord Avamork slammed the staff into the floor, cracking the granite and ceasing the rumble. He then utilized the staff as a cane while pacing Nick again in circles. He smirked. Your father was too weak to rule. Don't talk about my father, shouted Nick. Silence! Avamork smacked him so hard across the face that it sent Nick straight to his knees. Nick! Emma stepped into a run when Mr. McTwizzle grabbed her arm and held her back. Your father was a pitiful excuse of an elf. Avamork kicked Nick in the mouth, hurling him on his back. Nick spat blood, then wiped his mouth clean with the back of his hand. Our family comes from a long line of warriors. Elves with magic sparked from courage, strength, determination. And your father? Avamork finished his words with disdain. Hope. Avamork noticed Nick trying to stand, so he kneed him in the gut. Nick dropped back to his knees, bending forward as warm blood dribbled down his chin. Imagine. Hope, he chuckled darkly. For as long as Claus' village has stood, descendants of Saint Nikolai have led the elven race into eras signified by their individual spark. Avamork punched Nick in the face, leaving a ringing in his ear. Your father's spark was hope. Have you ever heard of a weaker spark? I guess you have, he cringed. Love. Get up, Nick. Get up, Joey encouraged. Please, Nick, begged Holly. You have to, cried Abigail. You just have to. Nick could hear their young, sweet voices over the ringing, but it wasn't enough. His vision was blurry and his head pounding. His whole body was left aching. Come on, Nick, said Toby. You can do it. You can. I know you can. Avamork spoke over the children. Come now, nephew. How do you expect to rule elvenkind with love? You think the magical community would take you seriously, let alone the monsters of the world? A boy, half human, half elf, leading the most prominent magical species in existence with love? He cackled, and in the distance chuckled Belsnickel and the Yetis. Do you honestly think anyone would ever believe in you? Nick crawled toward the children, all cheering for him. Avmark lifted the northern staff and waved it. The stone sparkled, and instantly Nick collapsed flat on his belly, screaming from jolts of agonizing pain. This is pathetic, Nick, Avmark shouted over the crackling jets of magic flaring from the staff and crashing into Nick. The feeling was comparable to being continuously electrocuted. Come on, fight me with your love. Nick screamed through convulsions of pain and spasming muscles. It was excruciating, a shock to his nervous system. He couldn't move his body, let alone hold a thought. He had no control over himself at all. He jerked and kicked, twitching as the northern staff continued to blast him with flares of dark magic obtained through children's fears. He could feel their fears at 1,000-fold, all the children Avmark had ever frightened. Their cries and screams rang in his ear, making them bleed. Avmark retracted the staff, reining the magic back into the stone. He caught Nick weakly crawling toward his friends again. He used the staff to strike him back down. Avmark crouched in a slow, intimidating fashion. He then grabbed Nick's golden hair and yanked him forward. He brought his long, scarred snout up to Nick's ear and whispered, "You're just an orphan. No one will ever believe in you." Avmark threw him back on the floor of the balcony. "You see," he shouted, rising. "My fellow elves, do you now see?" He leered down the icy stairs and into the town square where hundreds upon hundreds of elves were now congregating. "This boy, this half-breed boy, is supposed to be your ruler? Do you wish to believe in him or me? I can lead us into an age united with the monsters of this world, making our race more powerful than ever. He will lead you with love. Love! Believe in him, and I promise you, Claus village will fall." Nick laid on his back, face bloodied, body throbbing, defeated. He looked up into the sky, catching the lone star sparkling through the aurora lights. He rolled over, arms shaking, legs buckling, and then he fell back again. Toby stepped into the circle of surrounding children and shouted, "I believe in him." Avmark whipped around and laughed when he spotted the tubby little boy looking up at him. "Do you know why I've been kidnapping children from around the world?" He approached a trembling Toby slowly, enjoying as he watched the orphan's eyes grow 3 sizes bigger. "You're all a gift to the monsters imprisoned in Twilight Bridge. Now that I have the northern staff, I can open the gates and finally set them free. I'm sure they're hungry." He used the staff to poke Toby in his round belly. "You look like a good snack." Joey stepped forward and shouted, "I believe in Nick too." "And me." Abigail followed Joey and took his hand. Holly came forward. "I believe in him." And then Iris, "That's right. I believe in Nick," said Dover. Then Luke, following Lyric, and then Isla reaffirmed it. Throughout the encircling crowd lifted young, courageous voices, all shouting that they believed in Nick. Mr. McTwizzle joined in, and then so did Cupid, Bafana, Bartholomew, and Mr. and Miss Pransley, and on they went. Olivia Faye took each other's hands, and then they stepped forward with all the other children. "We believe in Nick. We all believe in him." Avmark couldn't help but cackle at them all. Nick, however, felt a new ignition in his heart, and it stopped him from shaking. He had managed to get onto his knees again when he caught Emma crouching down beside him, with Gilbert perched on her shoulder. "I believe in you, Nick," she smiled, and Gilbert squeaked, "I've always believed in you." Suddenly, all of Nick's pain washed away. He wasn't sore or aching, but radiating with overwhelming strength. He lifted himself up, turning to Avmark, cackling at the children. "My friends believe in me." Avmark spun around, surprised to meet eyes with Nick. "But more importantly, I believe in myself." Nick could feel the magic coursing through him. He lifted his arms, spun them around over his head, and then shot a fiery flare of crimson magic. Avmark swung the northern staff, igniting a jet of black. Their magical spurts collided, wild sparks igniting across the balcony, cutting through the granite. Nick pushed his magic forward, and then so did Avmark, during which children scurried to dodge the flares ricocheting from the collision. Nick cringed while he pushed his magic against Avmark's. That's when he spotted Gilbert popping out of his satchel with a cracker bell. "Gilbert now!" he shouted. The little field mouse ran forward and then pitched the golden bell. The cracker bell bounced. Boing, 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 and then exploded into the colliding magic. Nick and Avamark were ripped apart and hurled backwards across the balcony, rolling to a stop at opposite ends. Thick smoke crackling with different colors tumbled across the granite, spilling off the balcony and into the village below. Nick jumped to his feet and Avamark to his hooves, both spotting the northern staff laying between them. They charged and clashed together. Avamark snatched Nick by the throat and lifted him. "Nick!" Choking, he turned to find Emma in the crowd. She was holding Bafana's dagger, forged with a jagged coal blade. "Catch!" She tossed it. Nick shot up his hand and caught it, then drove it straight through Avamark's arm. Wreathing in pain, Avamark screams. "How did you come by this?" he roared, releasing his nephew as Nick pulled the dagger out from his uncle's arm. "It doesn't matter. You won't get to use it again," Avamark exclaimed. They stood before each other, Avamark cupping his wound, Nick wielding Bafana's dagger, both preparing themselves for their next move. A sudden strike as the cold, dark coal courses through the air. Nick lunges forward to engage his wounded uncle, and melody begins to take shape. A vicious dance is performed with perfect motion, swift and silent. Avamark strike out with the strength of a raging storm, but then surprised that Nick was gone, vanished from sight. Avamark stood alone in the crowd. He wearily looks around. From the shadow of the decayed tree, Nick's dagger cuts the night with a blade that arches on lightning, only to be blocked by a thunderous return. Nick and Avamark encircle each other. The stir in their eyes see souls of the fallen as each fights for life. Poetic motions ensued as strike after strike fails by both. Almost motionless steps and silent sweeps as their magic collides, igniting the darkness. An awe of beauty depicts in the impact. Nick strikes the unwelcoming soul of his uncle as Avamark turns into the vast expanse of night. Avamark has gone into the shadows of the darkness. Again there is an anticipated pause. Nick exhales deeply, enchanted and driven by an awe of caution, as he knows he is only a heartbeat away from his adversary, who would be waiting to strike as soon as his guard is dropped. A surge of aggression comes from behind the cloak of darkness as Avamark strikes out from the shadows, and the flow of poetic motion continues, encircling each other again. The forces that propel this battle engulf the area in a blanket of war. The spell of this dance is broken by another. "Nick!" He turned and caught eyes with Emma again. "Cheap shot!" Nick cracked a smile. He jumped forward, thrust his foot between Avamark's legs, curled his foot behind his shin, gripped the hilt of the dagger, then drove it straight through his uncle's heart. Avamark backed away, roaring so loud that all of the children had to cover their ears. He tripped over Nick's foot, falling back, lifeless. The orphans ran for Nick. They hoisted him up onto their shoulders, cheering loudly. All of the kidnapped children soon joined in with the celebrations, and they all chanted Nick's name. On the shoulders of his family and friends, and bathing in the aurora lights, Nick looked around and found the streets of Claus village crowded with elves. There were near 1,000 of them now, and they were all cheering for him. Cannons went off and fireworks exploded in colorful sparks above the great hall, all while Cupid chased down Belsnickel and the Yeti, chaining them up with snaps of his fingers. The elves were all laughing, some even crying, all overcome with a joy they thought they might never witness again. Nick peered around at all the merry faces, some children, others elves, and couldn't believe what a strange yet magical world he found himself in. He did notice that one face was missing. So many people, but he couldn't spot Emma in the crowd. The children finally lowered Nick back down, and they all parted as Mr. McTwizzle approached him with the northern staff laying in his open palms. The toy maker bowed. "I present to you, descendant of Saint Nikolai, defender of children, keeper of peace, the staff of your ancestors." Nick reached for the staff, thousands of eyes watching him. He wrapped his hand around the rod and lifted it. The stone sparkled and the aurora lights beamed as a warm, magical breeze blew through the village streets. By the time he lowered the staff, his clothes had transformed. No longer was he wearing stained slacks and a ripped wool sweatshirt, but instead black tights, a crimson tunic, and a black cape finished with a gold seam. It was the royal outfit of his ancestors, worn by his father and his father before him, all the way to a courageous elf by the name of Nikolai. Mr. McTwizzle took Nick by his shoulder. He ushered him over to the top of the icy steps, circled by children and friends while overlooking a sea of elves. Allow me to introduce our new leader. Mr. McTwizzle projected his voice. Son of Nicholas Claus and Aurora Pepperplum, the lost star of Claus Village, St. Nicholas. The audience erupted with cheers, and a new onset of fireworks exploded across the city. St. Nicholas, he smiled, and then giggled. I think I like the sound of that. Nick lifted up the northern staff. The stone glowed and sparkled. The tall, dead Christmas tree came to life with flourishing branches rich and green. He then gave the staff a whip, and the star at the top illuminated with a brilliant, twinkling light. Nick walked through the crowd of children, all of them parting to make way. He crouched down and found a little field mouse eating a piece of cheese he was given by an elven girl named Faye. Are you ready, Gilbert? The mouse finished his cheese and then peered up at Nick with black, beady eyes and twitching whiskers. I'll take that as a yes. Nick lowered the staff and directed the sparkling stone toward Gilbert. The mouse started to grow and grow, during which parts of him were changing. There were so many sparkles and shines twinkling around the mouse that it wasn't until they cleared that Nick could see his dear friend again. Gilbert's glasses were lopsided, and so he fixed them. I swear, if I never hear about cheese again, it'll be too soon. Nick ran to his friend, laughing. He threw his arms open and squeezed Gilbert so tightly that his glasses became lopsided again. It's so good to see you again. What an adventure, noted Gilbert. Yes, Nick fixed his glasses for him. What an adventure indeed. Nick turned and peered around, but still couldn't find Emma in the celebratory crowd. He was patted on the back, hugged by strangers, and so many elves chanted his name. He did, however, find Comet. Nick gave the staff a little twirl. Securing itself snugly around the calf's throat was a ruby collar, and tinkling from it was a gold tag inscribed with his name. Comet liked it very much. He licked Nick across the face, pranced around in a circle, then licked him again, but still no sign of Emma. After many hours of merry celebration, the crowd finally decided to migrate off the streets. Some continued to party indoors at either Perky's Pub or the Tinsel Tavern, while others returned home to send word to family and friends who didn't live in the North Pole. Soon the whole elven community would know that Lord Alvamark had fallen, and St. Nick had claimed his throne along with the northern staff, spreading the celebration far beyond the glacier walls of Claus Village. As the new leader, Nick appointed Mr. and Miss Pransley to ensure the safe return to all the children that had been kidnapped. The orphans from Lost Star Orphanage wished to stay with Nick in Claus Village, but he had to refuse, stating that back home in New York they would find families who would adopt them and have parents as they always wanted. There were a few tears from the younger children as they would miss their big brother Nick. Nick could see the anxious emotions building in their little faces and softly whispered from them all to hear, "But I will always be your big brother and will always love and find you." Luckily, Mr. and Miss Pransley offered to rebuild the orphanage and to care for the children. Miss Pransley had been wanting to be closer to her parents who lived in New York City as undercover elves working in American politics. Mr. Pransley had always wanted a big family, and so he couldn't have been more excited about their newest adventure. He would change the name of the orphanage because, after all, it seemed only right. Lost Star Orphanage would soon transform into Morning Star Orphanage, the same building, but brighter than ever before. Mr. McTwizzle decided to stay in Claus Village and reopen his emporium of fantastic trinkets and toys in the village square, but not before appointing his old apprentice as head toy maker back in the New York City location. As for Cupid, he had never felt a connection to Claus Village as he was born and raised in Murmansky, Russia, but now he had found his lost nephew, and his nephew was the new ruler of Elvenkind, so he thought he would stick around for a while. It was the right thing to do, and what his sister would have wanted. But the gorgeous group of fair elven ladies waving at him from across the bar at Perky's Pub did help sway his decision. It was coming close to dusk, and the aurora borealis light shone so bright in the darkening sky. Nick left the great hall and wandered across the granite balcony, and that's where he finally found Emma. She was standing under the beautiful Christmas tree, fixing an ornament up on a branch. "I thought I lost you," said Nick, looking ridiculous walking with the staff, as it was several feet taller than himself. "Where did you go?" She conveyed to him sadly, "I just thought I'd give you your moment." Nick took a step closer, tugging at the collar of his new, extravagant tunic, as it was tight and near choking him. "It would have been better if you were there." She flustered. "Nick, Saint Nick, whatever it is they call you now." He stopped her. "I prefer Nick, actually." "Well, Nick, your highness or whatever, I hope you're very happy here." She whipped her bushy red hair over her shoulder and headed off. "Where are you going?" Her feet halted before she even knew they had. I'm not like you, Nick. I'm only a human. She slowly turned back around until her misty eyes met with Nick's. I don't belong here. She began to cry. I don't belong anywhere. My mom and dad are gone, so I'll have to go back to the orphanage. I'm just going to miss you is all. So stay, he said, catching her by surprise. Emma, I can't do this without you. I'd still be wandering the streets of New York City searching for the SS Vixen if it wasn't for you. I need you, Emma. Don't you see? I've always needed you. But I'm not an elf. Neither was my mother, and still the elves of Claus Village cherished her as the most magical human there ever was. Magic isn't just in the air. He slowly advanced toward her. It's in you, in me, and most strongly in our friendship. Their shoes touched. They were towered by the glorious Christmas tree, and hanging from a branch right above their heads, they both spotted a mistletoe. Oh, his cheeks burned red. I'm sorry, I didn't notice that was there. We can just pretend we didn't see it. Emma shook her head with a smirk. Oh, shut up. She leaned in and kissed him softly on the lips. His cheeks deepened to an even more vibrant shade of red. What are you two doing out here? Nick and Emma ripped apart. From between the pillars of the great hall came Gilbert, with Comet trotting alongside him. The tag on the cap's new collar jingled as he went. Nothing, they both shouted. Gilbert's forehead screwed suspiciously, but then his face softened. Well, I guess this is goodbye for now. Goodbye, asked Nick. Mr. and Miss Pransley are taking us all back home first thing tomorrow morning. I'm no good at goodbyes, confessed Gilbert. I thought it best to do it now and get it over with. Gilbert, you don't have to leave, Nick countered. You can stay here with me and Emma, and Comet too. The calf rubbed his head against Gilbert's leg, but Gilbert refused to look down so he wouldn't be swayed by the calf's misty blue eyes. I thought about it. Really, I did. But I think it's best I go. Why? Asked Nick. Don't you remember? I have parents who are going to adopt me. They're waiting for me. I have a chance at a family. A real family. It's something I've always wanted, but never thought possible. Gilbert caught the tears in Nick's eyes, but continued even still. You'll always be my big brother, won't you, Nick? Always, Nick knelt down and hugged his dear friend. No time or distance will ever change that. You got it? Gilbert nodded, then dried his eyes off against Nick's new crimson tunic. I should go before it gets any harder. He turned back for the great hall, but was stopped by Mr. McTwizzle standing under the magical glow of the glorious Christmas tree. He was an old elf with a child's heart, looking as silly as ever in his long hat knitted out from old socks. I have to say something you all should hear. Earlier this month, back when Sister Merryweather visited me at my toy shop, she was there to pick up a Christmas gift for Nick. But what I failed to mention to all of you before was that Sister Merryweather was also there for another reason, a gift for me as well. You see, I'm old and I haven't a family of my own, and knowing this, Sister Merryweather wanted to share the greatest gift she could with me, something far beyond my wildest imagination, and we all know how wild that can be, he chuckled. She spoke of a boy with a talent for inventing, and that she wanted to give him a home like no other, one where his dreams would come true and his wacky inventions would come to life. That gift, Gilbert, was you. Gilbert poked himself in the chest. For me, he asked, surprised. The old toy maker squatted, his long hat flopping onto his shoulder while he looked into Gilbert's eyes. I've lived an exciting life as a toy maker. It's an extraordinary line of work and a wonderful profession. I get to see magic born every day in the joy and laughter of all the children who visit my shop. My life has been filled with such joy, except for one missing piece. What's that? Asked Gilbert. You, Mr. McTwizzle smiled warmly. I always wanted to be a father, but never got the chance. He reached out for Gilbert's hands. Sister Merryweather didn't just come for the snow globe that night in the toy shop, but also to tell me that both our dreams and hopes could and would come true. She knew you deserved a parent who would love you and that could help you explore your gift for creating wonderful inventions. Tears began to glisten in each of their eyes. Gilbert, it was me. I'm the parent who had planned to adopt you, Mr. McTwizzle choked. And thanks to Sister Merryweather's forward thinking, I have the paperwork here in my hand. It came just a day or so after you left. I guess you can say that Sister Merryweather gave us both the most beautiful Christmas gift. And in all my long years on this marvelous planet, never have I been gifted one so special. That is, so long as you want me to be your father. Of course I do, Gilbert threw himself into Mr. McTwizzle's arms and squeezed him as tightly as a teddy bear. There's nothing I would want more in the world than to be your son. Mr. McTwizzle looked down at Gilbert before back across at Nick and Emma. steps back for a moment while lovingly holding Gilbert. Although you do know this means you won't be heading back to New York with Mr. and Miss Pransley in the morning, and that you'll be staying here with me in Claus Village for a while. Gilbert's eyes lit up with even more joy. Not only had he discovered the identity of his new family, but also he didn't have to leave his friends. He hugged Mr. McTwizzle even tighter than before. Nick and Emma shared a smile. They couldn't have been more happy for their friend. And best of all, Gilbert was staying in Claus Village. Nick had his best friend to share in the wonders that were before him. Mr. McTwizzle and Gilbert headed back toward the Great Hall when something Gilbert remembered caused him to stop. I nearly forgot. He spun back around. Nick, Emma, he smiled. Merry Christmas. Nick and Emma turned to each other, shouting, It's Christmas? They then caught the bright star at the top of the tree, twinkling brightly above them. I guess it is. Nick took Emma's hand and squeezed it. Merry Christmas, Emma. Emma smiled up at the beaming star. Merry Christmas, Nick. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Oh my gosh, it's so crazy to finish the book. So a couple things, I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys did enjoy it, please leave a review on Amazon. It would be really helpful. And some exciting news, Nick 2 is already done. It's in the editing process, but the whole book is already written with my editor, so it will be out. We're shooting right now for probably about October of 2023, so the book does continue. It's going to be a series of 5 books. I have it all planned and mapped out. Hopefully every Christmas for the next 5 years we'll have a new Nick story until the story is complete. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Merry Christmas. Love you guys all. Thank you for watching and reading the story with me.